To ask whether knowledge can be used as a tool of power is to confront one of philosophy's most enduring tensions: the relationship between truth and authority, between knowing and ruling. From Plato's philosopher-king to Foucault's analysis of the modern surveillance state, Western thought has persistently grappled with whether knowledge serves liberation or domination. Knowledge, in principle, is the search for truth. Yet in practice, it has often become an instrument of control, shaping what can be seen, said, and believed. This video explores that paradox through a historical and conceptual lens, tracing the evolution of knowledge as a mode of power from classical philosophy to the digital age. It examines how governments and corporations, inheritors of this long intellectual lineage, deploy knowledge systems. From statistical governance to algorithmic prediction, to manage populations and shape behavior, the central idea is that knowledge is never neutral. It is embedded within relations of power, and those who define what counts as knowledge define what counts as reality. In ancient philosophy, knowledge was not yet a weapon but an ethical ideal. For Plato, episteme signified a kind of knowing that transcended mere opinion. In the Republic, he envisioned a society ruled by philosopher-kings, those who possess knowledge of the forms, especially the form of the good. To know truth, in this conception, was to know justice itself. Knowledge was intrinsically tied to virtue and legitimate authority. However, embedded in this noble vision was an early form of epistemic hierarchy. Only the philosophers, those who had ascended from the cave of illusion, were fit to rule. Thus the Platonic model inaugurated attention, knowledge as enlightenment, but also as exclusion. The philosopher-king's rule was justified precisely because others did not know. Aristotle, more empirical in his method, democratized knowledge slightly by grounding it in observation, categorization, and logic. Yet his teleological framework, where each being has its natural place, also supported political hierarchies, from master to slave. The classical ideal thus linked knowledge with order. Knowing meant classifying, and classifying meant governing. In these beginnings, one already glimpses the structure of later epistemic regimes. Knowledge as the foundation of both wisdom and rule, truth and control. The medieval synthesis of Aquinas and scholasticism held that reason and revelation were complementary paths to truth. Yet by the time of the Renaissance and early modern science, a profound shift occurred. Knowledge became power, literally. Francis Bacon, in the Novum Organum, declared that knowledge itself is power. For Bacon, the goal of science was not contemplation, but mastery, to bind nature to our service and enlarge the bounds of human empire. This marked a turning point, the birth of instrumental reason. Knowledge ceased to be an end in itself and became a means of control over nature and by extension over human life. Thomas Hobbes extended this logic to politics. In Leviathan, he argued that order arises not from divine will, but from human artifice. The sovereign, armed with knowledge of human passions and fear, engineers peace through absolute power. Political knowledge thus became a technology of governance. Descartes, meanwhile, grounded certainty in the thinking subject, cogito ergo sum. But his dualism between mind and matter provided the philosophical underpinning for a mechanistic view of the world. Nature could now be objectified, dissected, and manipulated without ethical remainder. What Bacon and Descartes inaugurated was a rationality of control, an epistemology of domination that would fuel modern science, empire, and capitalism alike. The Enlightenment promised emancipation through reason, yet its rational universalism often concealed a politics of exclusion. Kant's call for autonomy and moral reason coexisted with an imperial gaze that classified cultures as civilized or barbaric. Rousseau's critique of civilization exposed how the pursuit of mastery corrupted natural virtue. Yet even he assumed human exceptionalism over nature. Knowledge, now institutionalized in academies, censuses, and bureaucracies, became a technology of administration. Governments used statistics, literally the science of the state, to measure and manage populations. The rise of colonialism demonstrated the darker side of Enlightenment rationality. Cartography, ethnography, and natural history became instruments of imperial control. To know a people was to rule them. Thus, knowledge no longer merely interpreted the world, it reorganized it. Rationality became a global project of ordering, mapping, categorizing, and governing life under the pretext of progress. By the 19th century, faith and reason began to fracture. Karl Marx exposed the material interests behind the objectivity of knowledge. Ideas, he argued, were not neutral reflections of reality, but products of economic and class relations. The ruling ideas of an age were simply the ideas of the ruling class. Knowledge then functioned as ideology, a veil concealing domination under the guise of truth. Friedrich Nietzsche, for his part, dismantled the very notion of objective truth. Behind every claim to knowledge, he saw a will to power, the drive of life to impose its own interpretations upon the world. Knowledge, for Nietzsche, is creative, perspectival, and inherently tied to domination. The scientist, the priest, and the philosopher are not disinterested seekers of truth, but competitors in the struggle for meaning. Together, Marx and Nietzsche revealed that epistemology is never innocent. Every system of knowledge, whether religious, scientific, or political, serves a regime of power, shaping the horizon of what can be known, said, or imagined. It is with Michel Foucault that the relationship between knowledge and power receives its most systematic articulation. For Foucault, knowledge and power are not separate domains but coextensive. Power does not simply repress. It produces, creates subjects, disciplines, bodies, and governs populations through regimes of truth. In Discipline and Punish, he describes the emergence of disciplinary institutions, schools, prisons, hospitals, as sites where knowledge becomes surveillance. The individual is made visible, measurable, and correctable. Power operates not through force, but through normalization. In the history of sexuality, Foucault shows that even liberationist discourses, talking openly about sex, for instance, are not outside power, but extensions of it. To know oneself is to internalize control. This Foucauldian insight transforms the classical question. Knowledge is not merely used by power, it constitutes power. Whoever defines the truth of madness, crime, or health wields authority over life itself. The modern subject, self-aware, productive, and disciplined, is the product of this epistemic regime. In the 21st century, the fusion of knowledge and power has reached unprecedented intensity. Data is the new epistemic currency. Governments and corporations now exercise control not through visible coercion, but through information. Surveillance capitalism transforms human behavior into raw data, mined, analyzed, and monetized. Platforms like Google, Meta, and TikTok accumulate knowledge of our preferences, movements, and desires, constructing predictive models that shape future behavior. The result is not traditional domination, but nudging, soft control through algorithms. Governments, too, operate within this epistemic matrix. Big data analytics, predictive policing, and biometric surveillance blur the boundary between governance and monitoring. The Panopticon that Foucault described is no longer a prison. It is a smartphone. The power of knowledge has become infrastructural, embedded in code, invisible, omnipresent. Yet this power operates under the banner of efficiency, personalization, and choice. The same ideological mask that Enlightenment rationality once wore. Knowledge systems today no longer justify themselves by truth but by utility. What matters is not whether something is true, but whether it works, whether it optimizes, whether it keeps the system running. Thus, the modern subject once again mirrors the Platonic cave dweller, surrounded by shadows, mistaking visibility for understanding and convenience for freedom. Despite its complicity in domination, knowledge also remains a site of resistance. Wherever power operates, counter-knowledges emerge, local, situated forms of truth that challenge official narratives. Critical scholarship, investigative journalism, and digital transparency movements function as modern expressions of this resistance. Yet even these are vulnerable to cooptation, transformed into commodities, hashtags, or spectacle. The ethical challenge, therefore, is not to abandon knowledge, but to reimagine it. To reclaim epistemology as a space of responsibility rather than mastery, an awareness of how knowing implicates us in systems of power. The question is no longer whether knowledge is power, but how to use that power responsibly, to liberate rather than dominate, to illuminate rather than surveil, to understand rather than manipulate. As we moved into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the mechanisms of knowledge as a tool of power became increasingly subtle, yet more pervasive. Governments, corporations, and global institutions discovered that control was no longer solely about physical resources, armies, or borders. It was about information itself. The rise of advanced communication networks and social media transformed knowledge into a currency that could shape perception, influence behavior, and guide societal priorities on a scale previously unimaginable. Unlike traditional institutions, these digital platforms blurred the lines between producers and consumers of information. Individuals could create, share, and amplify content, but simultaneously, algorithms and platform architectures could prioritize certain voices, silence others, and subtly nudge collective attention. Knowledge in this context is double-edged. It can empower citizens, connect communities, and accelerate learning. Yet it can equally concentrate power, allowing corporations and governments to direct narratives, reinforce agendas, and construct realities. Modern political actors exploit this dynamic in ways that echo older strategies of epistemic control. Governments can mobilize social media to shape public discourse, drive policy acceptance, and even manipulate electoral outcomes. Corporations wield knowledge strategically to cultivate loyalty, predict behavior, and influence markets. In each case, the tools themselves, platforms, networks, algorithms, become extensions of power, controlling not only access to knowledge but the very pathways through which knowledge circulates. The contemporary landscape demonstrates a profound truth. Knowledge, once confined to libraries, courts, and academic halls, now flows through invisible yet potent channels that shape societies in real time. Those who understand how information spreads, who controls the channels, and who frames the narrative, wield influence that rivals or surpasses traditional authority. Yet, this also offers hope. The same networks that can manipulate can also enlighten, democratize, and inspire. The challenge lies in navigating this terrain with discernment. Awareness of these dynamics allows individuals and communities to resist manipulation, to critically evaluate the knowledge presented, and to participate in shaping shared understanding rather than passively consuming it. Knowledge as a tool for power is neither inherently oppressive nor inherently liberating. Its moral and societal impact depends on the intentions and strategies of those who wield it, and on the vigilance and engagement of those who receive it. In the end, the story of knowledge and power remains the story of human choice. The instruments evolve, the scale grows. But the fundamental question endures. How will we use what we know, and who will decide how knowledge shapes the world? And so, knowledge drifts like a river, sometimes a quiet current, sometimes a roaring flood, shaping the landscapes of power, perception, and possibility. It touches every corner of human life, from the policies of governments to the strategies of corporations, from private conversations to the algorithms that curate our feeds. To see knowledge as a tool of power is not merely to recognize manipulation, it is to recognize responsibility. Those who understand its currents can guide them, not just to gain, but to illuminate, not just to dominate, but to connect. In this world, every click, every shared insight, every story told or withheld participates in a larger dance of influence. And we, as observers and participants, hold a subtle yet profound power ourselves, the power to question, to discern, to share wisely, and to choose what kind of world knowledge will shape. Perhaps in the end, the truest measure of power is not in controlling what others know, but in mastering how we ourselves engage with what is known and how we decide to let it flow.